Hi, and thank you for joining us for this Times Higher Education International Student event to discuss everything you need to know about studying in the United States. My name is Jamie Ramacati, and I'm the head of content for student events here at THE. THE has been a trusted resource in education for nearly 50 years, and we are very excited to now be providing more tools and resources to students at every stage of their education journey. You may be familiar with the THE World University Rankings, which provide performance metrics on hundreds of universities around the world. And in just a few moments, we're going to talk a bit more about those and other ranking sets provided by THE and how they can be a useful tool for you as you search for the right university and course. The United States continues to be a top destination for international students and boasts one of the world's strongest and most comprehensive higher education systems. But COVID-19, social unrest, and a very contentious presidential election in the States may be cause for some students to reconsider their plans. There is, though, some hope that a new presidential administration will make the US more desirable for international students, and that we will soon see the reversal of travel bans and other policies that have made it logistically difficult for international students to study in the States. To say nothing of changing the harmful rhetoric around foreigners and immigrants, which has made some students feel unwelcome. All of that said, the US still has the highest population of international students, and US universities have worked tirelessly to make sure that their international students have been well looked after during difficult times. Our aim is to use today's session to discuss some of these topical issues, which we know make a huge difference to students and their families when deciding where to study. But we'll also tackle some of the more practical questions around the application process, campus life, and choosing a university. Today's session is co-hosted with our partners, Shorelight and Crimson Education. Through these two partnerships, THE can connect students to even more resources to help them find and apply to the best fit universities in the United States. We have expert panelists affiliated with both organizations here today. Before I introduce our panel of experts and we dive into the Q&A, my colleague Sita Bardwa, student content editor at THE, is going to give us an overview of the higher education landscape in the US and tell us a little bit about how US universities have performed in the THE World University Rankings and the THE Wall Street Journal College Rankings. Following that, I'll introduce the rest of our panelists and we'll get started answering your questions. Many of you submitted your questions via email ahead of the session, but you can also submit them throughout the event using the Q&A function. And now I'll hand it over to Sita.
I'm Sita Bardwa, the student content editor here at Times Higher Education, and I'm going to provide a little overview around international students in the US and the performance of US universities in both our World University Rankings and our US College Rankings, which we publish in collaboration with the Wall Street Journal. Here are some slides to demonstrate US universities' performance in the rankings. The US has the highest population of international students in the world, with more than 1 million international students studying there. The highest number of international students in the US comes from China, followed by India, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Canada. The most popular subjects among international students coming to the US are business and management, engineering, maths and computer science, and the social sciences. The US has a huge number of universities, approximately 4,000, so it can often feel a little overwhelming to know where to start when you're considering applying to the US. And there are also lots of different types of universities, such as public, private, liberal arts, and historically Black colleges and universities. So it's always worth looking into these different types and trying to find an institution that suits you. We have a few resources on the THE student website that explain these different types of institutions. But to further help you search for universities in the US, you can use the Times Higher Education World University Rankings. World University Rankings are an annual ranking of universities around the world, looking at how well universities perform in 5 categories: teaching, research, citations, industry income, and international outlook. These are then broken down into 13 separate performance indicators, which you can see on this slide here. Each year, the rankings adapt and grow to include more countries and universities, and the most recent rankings, which came out at the beginning of September, included more than 1,500 universities from 93 countries and regions. The World University Rankings can help you choose a university by giving you more information about the quality of the teaching, the research output, the environment at different institutions, as well as how international an institution is. It also allows you to compare different universities across different countries, which can be really helpful. The World University Rankings table also includes some key data about universities, such as the staff-to-student ratio, the proportion of male and female students, and the percentage of international students at an institution, which can help you to further hone your choice depending on which of these factors are most important to you. There are a lot of universities in the US, as I mentioned before, so it can be hard to know where to start looking for the right one. So this is where the rankings can come in. The Times Higher Education World University Rankings for 2021 ranks 181 US universities, and the number one university in the US is Stanford University. 59 US universities are featured in the top 200. California is the most represented state among the best US universities, with 15 institutions, followed by 13 universities in New York, 12 universities in Texas, and 10 universities in Massachusetts. US universities also take the number one position in a number of our subject rankings, including the arts and humanities, business and economics, education, engineering, law, life sciences, physical sciences, psychology, and social sciences. And a US university appears in the top 5 of every single one of our subject rankings. So if I haven't mentioned your particular subject, then it's worth heading over to our website and exploring each interactive subject ranking table to see how US universities perform there. The subject rankings are a great resource for students to help them compare universities across their particular subject area and see how well certain universities and countries perform in their area of interest. We also produce the US College Ranking in partnership with the Wall Street Journal, which is more student-focused due to its emphasis on teaching rather than research. In 2021, the US College Ranking included almost 800 universities across the entire country. The ranking includes the results of the THE US Student Survey, which examines a range of key issues, including students' engagement with their studies, their interaction with their teachers, and their satisfaction with their experience. We were unable to conduct the student survey for this year's ranking due to the coronavirus pandemic, so we used the results from last year's survey, which was taken by more than 170,000 college students. You can explore the interactive US College Rankings table, where you can filter the universities depending on what you are most interested in, whether it's the cost of tuition fees, the living costs, or the average salaries for students 10 years after they leave university. We have more rankings than the one that I have mentioned here, and you can find them all on the Times Higher Education website and access the fully interactive tables. Within those tables, you can then click through to each university to find out a bit more information about each institution and the key data that I mentioned before. So if you are thinking about heading to university in the US, then the World University Rankings, the subject rankings, and the US College Rankings, as well as our other rankings, are a great resource to help you find a university that suits you, as well as exploring which universities value the same values that you do and places the issues that matter most to you at the top of their agenda. And you can also check out the student section of the THE website, which is dedicated to helping students find the information that they need to study abroad. So there are lots of guides around the application processes, information on scholarships, finances, student life, and student blogs that offer a first-hand account into what it is like to study in the US. There are blogs from students from Nepal, India, China, the UK, and many other countries. And they share what it was like to move to the US, what the application process was like, what studying at a US university is like, and how to make friends. I'm also sure that you'll have many questions around how US universities are supporting international students during the COVID-19 pandemic, and what your university life may look like as a result of increased online learning and travel restrictions. So please do ask them during the Q&A section of this webinar. And if you have any other questions about the rankings or choosing a US university, then please do ask that too. I will now hand back to Jamie, who will introduce the rest of the panelists and go through some of your questions.
Thank you, Sita. That's all incredibly helpful information for students. And I think you highlighted some great resources for students, particularly the student blogs on the THE student website, which will give a really personal perspective on what it's like to be an international student in the US, particularly for the students who have written blogs recently about what it's been like to be there during COVID and during a presidential election. So we definitely encourage you all to check those out. Sita will join the rest of the panel for our discussion. So as she said, if you have any further questions about the rankings or anything that she discussed in her presentation, please do pop those into the Q&A. I'd like to now introduce the rest of our panel. We have three experts with us who are here to answer all of your questions, top to bottom. We are delighted to have with us Jamie Beaton, CEO and co-founder of Crimson Education. Jamie has an incredibly impressive list of academic achievements and credentials. His experience applying to universities as an international student is what led him to create Crimson Education, to help level the playing field and help more young people around the world successfully apply to top universities. We're also joined by Dr. Jennifer Schnetter. Jenny is the managing director of UOP International, a collaboration between Shorelight and the University of the Pacific, which provides pathway and English as a second language programs for international students. She has many years of experience in global higher education, including partnership management, overseas campus strategy and implementation, and international student enrollment. And finally, we have Steve Robinson joining us today from the University of Utah, where he is the Senior Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management. Steve oversees all matters related to student recruitment, registration, and financial aid, and is focused on growing the international student population at the University of Utah. So first of all, a massive thank you to all of you for joining us today. We were saying before the panel started that you are joining us from all corners of the globe this morning or this evening, depending on where you are. And so we are all the more grateful for your time, knowing that you are up very early or very late, depending on where you are. We've got lots of questions from students, questions that came in via email before the session started, but I'm also seeing lots of questions coming in via the Q&A. I'd like to start with a few for each of the panelists. And Jenny, I'm going to start with you. It's obviously been a really difficult year for universities and for students across the globe. But we've heard a lot of great feedback about how universities in the States have supported their international students in particular. Can you tell us a little bit about how UOP International has looked after your students and what support you've provided to them?
Sure, it'd be my pleasure. And so UOP stands for University of the Pacific. And being based in California, we've been very fortunate to have a very strong state response to COVID-19. And that has really informed and shaped how the university has supported students and devised strategies to ensure that they are healthy and safe. That becomes the most important experience for our students when they are currently studying with us, or if they're considering, joining us for the upcoming spring semester. So I think I'll just highlight a few points that we've done this past year. I would say the first is that because we were an early adopter of requirements in terms of safeguards, we have a statewide mask mandate. At the university level, we're also a small private university of less than 7,000 students. So we're able to have socially distanced and appropriate spaces for students who need to remain on campus, as many of our international students did, to live in private bedrooms and apartments where we have a number of we have our application that students have to use every day to monitor their health and safety and their well-being. We have required mask wearing. We have increased sanitation and cleanliness on campus. And then as we look to the spring semester, students, because our university has a flexible model in place, students can choose to return to campus to live there under these new safety precautions, or they can choose to remain in their home countries if they're unable to arrive and study with us virtually. So we've looked at all aspects of the international student experience and have tried to introduce opportunities for them to continue to study, but also to remain safe and healthy.
That's great, thank you. And I'm sure we're going to come back to that particular topic later on in the session, but I think it's really reassuring for students to hear all of the measures that are in place to keep students safe and to make them feel at home if they're remaining on campus. Steve, I'd like to turn to you now. In my opening remarks, I mentioned some of the circumstances in America that have led international students to possibly reconsider their plans, as if a global pandemic wasn't enough of a challenge. It's been a difficult few years politically and even socially in America. And I think also often how some of those things are perceived in international media can be a bit frightening for students, quite bluntly. What are you seeing in terms of international student application and enrollment trends? And if you had a crystal ball, what do you think will change, if anything, over the next few years with a new presidential administration?
Sure. Thank you, Jamie. Great question. One of the things that we're watching here at the University of Utah is a trend upwards, which is great news, that we're seeing more interest from international applicants than we did at the same time last year, which makes sense in the terms of COVID. The election was still forthcoming. So I would say that I'm very optimistic about what's coming in this future year. We're seeing changes already that I think that predict a good year for international students, both at the University of Utah, but probably nationally as well. And there's a sort of sense of optimism about a return to normalcy. And I mean, I never thought normalcy would be something I'd be advocating for, but here I am. With the election, almost in the rearview mirror, and with perhaps a vaccine around the corner, we're starting to see some changes that signal that there is a growing confidence that a lot about higher education in the United States will be back to what it was, or very close to what it was, maybe by as soon as this fall, which is, I think, wonderful news for both the higher education community in the States, as well as international applicants and even domestic applicants as well, who are looking for that on-campus experience that everyone has been kind of hoping for and working towards for many years.
That's great, thank you. And I think we'll come back to that later in the session, because I definitely want to talk about the value of that on-campus experience and what that means for students who may not be able to be on campus right now. Jamie, you're in the hot seat now. I know that you founded Crimson as a result of your own experience applying for university as an international student and some of the sort of obstacles and questions and things that you face trying to do that from afar. Now that Crimson has been working with students around the world for 7 years, what are you seeing are some of the biggest obstacles for international students who are trying to find and apply to programs in the States?
So I think the biggest obstacle is, in general, the US is the most rigorous of all countries in terms of application criteria. For example, a typical college applicant, there's a 4-year consideration of your academics, extracurriculars, leadership, personal characteristics, your interviews, etc. And so typically for a lot of other countries, only academics in the last kind of couple of years really matter, but the US is just much more comprehensive. And because a lot of these top programs coming out of schools like Harvard, Stanford, etc., just get such good graduate outcomes, there's just been a consistent rise in demand from international students, and even throughout this period for those top tier schools. So I think the biggest challenge for your average international student is how to get in, what you need to know to build a kind of competitive profile, etc. I think there's some practical considerations also of knowing sort of which school's the best fit for you. Some students are going to thrive in, a very engineering focused school like a Caltech. Others are going to really enjoy a liberal arts college like a Middlebury. And those types of choices are definitely better, made when you have that context from, students who've actually gone to those schools, etc. So I'd say there's a bit of information asymmetry for many international students like myself back in the day. And there's, of course, the more meaty question of how you actually get into an institution that you want to invest your time and money behind.
That's great. And that's a perfect segue to my question for Sita, because Sita mentioned in her presentation that the number of higher education institutions in the US is well into the thousands. And that can be really daunting for students who are just beginning their search. And of course, the rankings are a great place to start. But as you mentioned, Jamie, there will be students who are thinking, okay, well, how do I even begin to decide between a place like a Middlebury and a place like, a Caltech or a large research institution, a large university? So Sita, my question for you is, again, the rankings are a great place to start, but where else would you recommend that students who are just beginning to consider their options and might be feeling overwhelmed by choice, where would you recommend that they begin, and how can they start to narrow that list down?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I think that there are a lot of different factors that students can start looking into when they are looking for a university in the US. So they can kind of consider lots of different things like what the student life is going to be like there, what the international student community is like. I think, as Jamie mentioned, getting testimonials and blogs from students that are already there or have studied at a university that they're interested in is a really, really great place to start and kind of bring that kind of personal touch to your search. But also kind of looking at how, what kind of teaching goes on, the different kind of things that you'll learn in the subject that you're most interested in, and those kinds of things are really important factors to look at. But as you said, it is really daunting. So on THE Student, we've got lots of different resources and different student blogs and advice pieces that can help you when you're just at the beginning of your journey.
Great. Thanks, Sita. Another sort of daunting question for students, and we received a handful of questions via email, and I think there have already been a few questions coming in the Q&A about this, is funding. It's really no secret that the cost of higher education in the United States can be quite high, and it's a significant investment for students and their families, and that makes the decision and picking the right place and understanding what those outcomes will be all the more important because of the investment that they're making. Jenny, I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about, what you would recommend to students who are feeling a little bit of sticker shock from the price tag of a US education, and where you might recommend that they look for funding opportunities and how to help sort of mitigate that cost as much as they can.
Sure. It's such an important discussion to have, either at the undergraduate or graduate level. I think there are probably three things I would recommend to any student. And the first is that many institutions are looking for really outstanding academically qualified students and offer scholarships and awards for those students to come join them. That's here at Pacific, for some of our partner universities in Shorelight as well. So I encourage students to definitely inquire and look at those opportunities. The second, I think, is also to consider looking at the total cost of your degree. And particularly because so many students come in to study STEM subjects, but also those that are not STEM related, as Sita mentioned. Many degree programs offer work opportunities, internships through CPT, and/or maybe have programs that allow them to continue to remain in the US through OPT. And some of them, like at Pacific, are required. So these are also potential funding sources that should be considered, though not guaranteed, as part of how do you look at the return on your investment and funding your education. And then I think the third option is that we're seeing a small increase in companies that offer third-party loans for students who are in the US. Certainly Shorelight partners with some of these companies, but these are also some growing opportunities for students who, once they are here and they're looking for additional funding to help their studies, are worth also considering in terms of the overall ability to afford an education.
That's great, thank you. Jamie, kind of off the back of the question about funding and kind of understanding the total cost of an education, I know that Crimson works with so many students who are considering lots of different types of universities in the US, small, big, some that are more expensive than others. But I wonder what you would say to students who are wondering, okay, this is so expensive, is this worth the investment? What is the return on investment going to be? What is the experience going to be like? And particularly now when some students may have to begin their learning online, I think there's a lot of questions about, is this really worth the financial and the time investment that it's going to take, because that price is so high?
Great question. Let me just start with a story to kind of illuminate how this looks. So one of our students, a boy named Lucas Lee, came along to Crimson when he was about 15. He grew up in Auckland, New Zealand, and he's quite interested in business and finance. And if he stayed within his home country, he would have gone to probably University of Auckland and done reasonably well, gone to probably Deloitte or a big four accounting firm, and probably started on a salary of about roughly 30,000 British pounds. He went through Crimson, got on to Harvard and Princeton. He's now an investment banker in New York, and he's earning about 110,000 USD. So roughly, 3 to 4x what he would have earned had he stayed within New Zealand. So my view on this is basically, if you're going to a top tier US institution, the kind of institutions that have recruitment track records with Wall Street, with big tech in California, with entrepreneurship centers like Y Combinator, the payback will be very quick. You're going to be earning 80K to 100K USD plus quickly once you get out of school. But there are many skills that I think add very limited value in the US as well. So you need to really filter very carefully. And I think usually what I advise students is, if you have domestic options in your home country, you only want to go to America if at least you're going to schools that are significantly higher ranked than anything you have available locally, because you don't want to be traveling across the world to go to an unranked school. A classic sort of example I'll give you is there are many student athletes that go to the US on quasi scholarships to some pretty uncompetitive colleges. They don't have a particularly great experience, and then they don't necessarily get the jobs they want coming out of that. So we are very focused on getting our kids into schools that really deliver for the student, and we measure that through the salaries that these graduates are getting when they hit the Goldman Sachs, the McKinseys of the world, etc. So I really think consulting the Times for Education rankings, etc., to really make sure that you're investing behind a university with a real reputation that's actually selective and really is filtering students properly, is how you want to approach that.
Great, thanks. I think there's also, and Steve, I hope maybe you can comment on this, but I think there's also something to be said for just the experience, for a student who maybe doesn't have options domestically that they feel would really be suited to what they want to study or the type of university experience that they want to have. Steve, you work at an institution that is actively trying to grow your international student population. You take very good care of your international students, and maybe you can just talk about sort of the value just in that experience of coming to a university in the United States, expanding your horizons, less about sort of specifically the outcomes, but more just about what those 4 years look like and how a student will really benefit from that experience.
Sure. One of the things that we talk a lot about at the University of Utah, and I imagine many institutions domestic or many institutions in the US do as well, is that we're looking to create global citizens of our graduates. That when someone completes a baccalaureate degree at the University of Utah or any of the other schools here in the US, and we want to make sure that that person is ready not just to engage in their field and become successful there, but also to become a successful world citizen. And that comes from, I think, going through the crucible of a 4-year experience with lots of students who believe different things, who come from different backgrounds, and who are looking for people who differ from them as well, and trying to find those, not just the similarities, but also to learn from those differences. So we look for ways that we try to make sure that the students that come to the University of Utah, and I don't believe we're alone in this, find ways to grow that in that venue also. The academics are hugely important. I agree with everything Jamie just said in terms of looking at outcomes, but there are also those intangible outcomes that are important as well that we need to factor into that. Problem is they're a lot harder to sort of gauge at times, and a lot of it has to do with the individual student, but they are critically important and we shouldn't lose sight of them.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I have a few questions here about just kind of the current status of international student visas. Jenny, maybe you are best to just touch on that. What's the current status of international student visas for a student who wants to come, let's say, starting in the fall of next year? It's a long way off and it's hard to say what the status will be by then. Lots of changes in America between now and then, but what is the status today if a student wanted to get a student visa?
Well, I think what we're doing is we're monitoring very closely embassy reopenings and some of the policy changes that are likely to come with the changeover in the administration here nationally. And I think all of that bodes well for international students who are eager to arrive. We are seeing a handful of students who are actually already getting their visas for the start of the spring semester. But of course, some of the larger countries that historically many students arrive from. They're slowly starting to reopen, or we're starting to see them advertise when prospective dates are going to start for sitting for their appointments. So I think for students who are eager to arrive for the fall, it's a really good time to still move forward with applications. For many students who may have deferred from last fall, or even from just this past spring, students may still be able to apply now and be admitted for the spring or even summer semesters for some institutions. So I think we will see continued reopening for embassy and visa appointments, and ideally increased numbers of students arriving, if not for spring, then certainly in the fall.
That's great. And I think really reassuring for students who might be thinking, gosh, I want to go in the fall, but should I be putting all of this work into applications if there's a chance I may not get my student visa? And of course, there's always a chance. We can't ever predict exactly what will happen, but it's reassuring to hear that, you foresee embassies and consulates reopening and allowing students to get in for those visa interviews and get their F1 student visas to get to the States. Jenny, I'm going to stick with you for just a second, because you mentioned this in one of your answers earlier about your international students staying on campus. And we had a question come in from the audience asking, what do international students do during school holidays, and can they stay on campus? And I think that's probably always been a question for international students, but it's particularly relevant now with travel restrictions and COVID, and students going, okay, so I'm going to go all the way to the States to study, and then am I going to be stuck there? Will I be able to go home? So what are the options available to international students at your institution, and how have you made sure that they've got a place to live if they can't get home?
Yeah, I think there's no greater angst for a student than not knowing where they're going to be when they're in the US during the pandemic. Certainly we saw that in a lot of articles and a lot of commentary and blogs. And so we're so appreciative at Pacific that our students can stay here. I think in terms when breaks happen, and in the historical period, you'd see a lot of students stay in the US, take the opportunities to travel or go back home and reconnect with their family members and return. That's obviously not going to be as easy this time around as we approach some of the upcoming winter holidays. But we are seeing students look at more localized experiences and ability to safely move around either in their state or even between states as things potentially reopen, or there are additional guidance in place about safe travel to other locations. But then what we've seen is a lot of our students who are on campus, they feel very comfortable remaining where they are. They made that personal sacrifice in terms of staying in the US during the time of the pandemic when many of their families wanted them to come home. And they feel comfortable remaining in the US, using that time to potentially look for future internship opportunities for the summer, and then also remaining on campus where they feel familiar to their experience. So we have a little bit of both sets of students, some who are eager to kind of explore a little bit safely, and those who are just waiting and comfortably remaining on campus.
Great. Steve, do you want to add anything about how you all have handled this at University of Utah, and how your international students have handled being on campus if they are there, and what their plans are for the holidays and how you're going to support them through that?
Sure, I'm happy to. I would like to go back to something that Jenny was saying a few moments ago about application cycles and how we're all watching reopenings and then the scheduling of actual appointments for international applicants. We're following a very similar strategy with what the University of the Pacific is doing as well. But one thing I want to emphasize is that the University of Utah, and I imagine many institutions in the U.S., are being very flexible about how we handle deferments. If you apply for the fall semester, for instance, and you are admitted, there are plenty of opportunities to push that admission back to a future term. We're being much more, I think, accepting and liberal about our policies. At my university, and I don't think we're alone in that regard, about how far out we will let students defer their admission, because we're aware that there's just not access to the embassies like there used to be prior to COVID. So we want to be as understanding as possible. So it's not a binary decision, either it's fall or nothing. You can push your admissions out future terms once once that decision's been made in many, if not all places. Going back to holiday breaks, yes, we're following a very similar strategy here that students can remain on campus if they choose to. We've set up a kind of mentorship program with some of our continuing international students, with our new students in particular, to make sure that there's opportunities for for socialization beyond just what was happening in the classroom prior to the break. We're looking at ways to keep people engaged within the community, both on campus as well as in Salt Lake City, where we're located, and making sure that people don't feel isolated. That's, I think, one of the dangerous things over a holiday break for any student, if they stay on campus, is that there suddenly is a massive sort of move out away from campus for a little while. Thankfully, we're in a fairly large city, and that's not going to necessarily be the case here because of just our population, but also because the university is being very purposeful and intentional in making sure that we have things for international students to do during the breaks.
Great. You bring up a really good point about deferrals and postponing study, and this question came up in a conversation we had a few weeks ago about a similar topic, but about studying in the UK, and it came in from a few students via email before this session. I think there's perhaps some concern from students that a lot of students who were admitted for this year are going to defer their enrollment to next year, and thus if a new student wants to apply, their chances of being admitted will be lower because they're now up against sort of all these students who deferred, who are filling up places in the class. Can you either dispel or verify that myth for us, Steve, and let us know how you guys are handling that?
For my university, that's not an issue, that students who are admitted and defer their admission and opt to come a future term are not considered, against a new applicant, because we don't know in terms of the deferrals how many students will actually decide to follow through and come to campus. So we don't use those numbers in any way. It's an apples and oranges comparison in a way in terms of students. The student who was admitted for fall 2020 who deferred to fall 2021 is not going to be in competition with a new applicant for fall of 21. It really doesn't work that way. So I would not worry about that at all, because it's very different math that we're using when we're trying to build our new class of students. And we don't look at that typically in terms of, what a deferred student is going to do.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Jamie, we've had a few questions come in about extracurricular activities and work experience. And I think it's, as we maybe shift gears a little bit to talk about kind of the application process and how to make a really strong application to a US university, there have been a few questions about, well, my internship has been canceled, or it's really difficult to engage in extracurricular activities because of COVID. So what advice would you give to students who are feeling like their hands are tied a little bit because they want to be building their resume and they want to be, really cultivating some experience that's going to make them a really competitive applicant, but they feel like they can't get that experience right now? What can and should they be doing if they're not able to do those other things?
So I guess the first thing that I would say is it's really important for students to recognize that COVID, on the one hand, is limiting access to local physical extracurriculars, but it's also opening up extracurriculars that were never previously global to kids from anywhere in the world. So we're seeing ambitious Crimson kids that are thinking about getting into these top schools actually able to do more activities now. For example, recently there was a Tiger Global Case competition led by a top hedge fund in the US. This competition was set by more than 2,000 high schools around the world. So these students can sit from any country, compete in this competition, and then that kind of activity is really wonderful on their applications. Many of those winners are going off to apply to schools like Wharton, NYU Stern, University of Michigan, etc. So I would say, first of all, leverage a lot of our content we put out on extracurricular opportunities, and leverages online ones, essay writing competitions, online Model UN, online debating, online volunteering opportunities, etc. Use things like change.org campaigns to get things out there. So there are a couple of different ideas that I would touch on. I would also say that when you actually do the application process, part of the guidance we provide students is on the application essays. And there are sections on your application where you talk about any challenges you've had to deal with during COVID. So if you did get an internship, but then it got cancelled, you can describe that in excruciating detail as to why you weren't able to pursue that, and what that meant for you. So that context around the challenges that have affected you, alongside that mindset that I would recommend to kind of take advantage of the situation to access more things, is sort of in totality what a lot of top candidates are doing at the moment. And the advice varies a little bit, whether you're applying to, say, a PhD program or a business school or undergraduate college. But that in spirit would be kind of what I would say.
Great. And I think sort of your advice resonates, COVID or not COVID. I mean, the idea that students really should be taking challenges and obstacles that they've faced and turning those into positives in their application and demonstrating ways that they, advocated for themselves or got creative and sort of overcame those challenges. Those are great things for them to highlight in their applications, even if they're unrelated to COVID.
Yeah, that's very well said. I mean, one of the key considerations for the US universities is often how well students are doing relative to their environment, right? So if you're applying from a community that's very affected by COVID, or a disadvantaged school, or from a place that isn't really represented very often at a particular institution, then the admissions officers are going to put more weight on your profile. So it's very important, for example, in the application essays, that you're sharing that personal identity, those challenges you've overcome very specifically. You also need to be quite pragmatic, though, because there are a lot of people in the world that have faced some pretty profound challenges. So you want to make sure that you're not kind of overselling adversity that isn't authentic, because that really kind of shines through. But to the extent you've dealt with real challenge, it's really important to highlight that, articulate that well. And the US is one of the few countries that really puts a lot of focus on the personal statement. Many other countries, like the UK, like Australia, are really academic focused on grades. But the US will make exceptions and adjust candidacy a little bit for really powerful statements, etc. So if you are a student looking at your own academic transcript, you're thinking about what's a country that will actually I think of my personal circumstance in a lot of detail. The US is wonderful for that, and really recommended.
That's great. And we could and likely will next year do a whole series of sessions on just tips for writing a strong personal statement, because it's true, it is such a critical part of the US application, and it really is a holistic evaluation process at the vast majority of colleges and universities in the US. Sita, I want to just turn to you for a second, because one of the other things that COVID has disrupted, and I actually think we've done a great job of highlighting some of the sort of silver linings behind some of those disruptions, and highlighted some opportunities that students have had as a result. But one of the things that it's disrupted is the ability for students to visit a campus and actually see it for themselves and take a tour and meet students face to face and learn a little bit more about what that campus experience would be like. What would you recommend to students who are feeling like they're going into this process a little bit blind? I think some of the resources you've already named are likely great, but if you can just reiterate how students can really get a feel for a campus and how they can get to know a university without actually going and visiting the campus in person.
Yeah, I think that's something that universities are definitely aware of, and they are trying to ensure that they kind of provide as much information online for students, so that when they can't go and visit there, they can sort of get a feel for campus life. So I think lots of universities are trying to kind of do campus tours online. They're having like Q&A sessions with students, so that students can kind of have a look at what is really going on campus without having to go there.
Great. Thanks. And I think you mentioned earlier the student blogs we've mentioned a couple of times, but in addition to the THE student blogs, I think students will also find that a lot of universities provide those student perspectives on their websites or through their admissions offices as well. So Jenny or Jamie or Steve, did either of you want to add anything to just how students might get to know universities when they can't go and visit the campus? Jamie?
Yeah. I guess one great resource I'd point you to would be our YouTube channel. So if you go Crimson Education on YouTube, we have filmed more than 1,000 day in the life videos of students at top universities. So you can see a student go around their day, figure out what classes are like, what the dorms are, what the food's like. We also do big question series where we ask students questions like, what do you write your application on? How do you find the recruiting experience? How do you find Saturday night? So it's everything from the fun stuff all the way through to the heavy duty work. So that's a really great resource. Another thing that I would kind of point to also would be our extracurricular database. which talks a lot about what extracurriculars the various campuses offer. And then also you can tap into a lot of our analyses on what different schools are looking for in their supplementary essays. So a lot of schools ask for school-specific questions like what do you want to do if you join an engineering program? So you can check out those resources too. So there are a couple of things that I would point to. And then sort of not necessarily Crimson related, I would say I'd recommend you dig into universities' specific department pages as well, not just the general university. So if you're applying to, say, Columbia for financial engineering, if you go and find certain professors at that department that are doing work, you look at what activities they're doing, what lectures they're doing, you put that in your application, that's going to really give you a lot more oomph when you come to applying. So there are a couple of resources that I would point to for the students in the call today.
That's great. Thank you. Jenny?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the question you asked, I don't think is necessarily a new question related to or an experience for students due to COVID. Many students often cannot arrive to campus to visit in advance. So I think some of the resources that colleagues have shared have been there and are available, but certainly there's more emphasis on how do we do mostly exclusively virtually. And so I certainly share in Jamie's comments about there's a lot of resourcing and videos from student perspectives. I know at Pacific, because we value a very small faculty to student ratio, absolutely our faculty want to talk to all prospective students. And it's not really to assess their applications. It's really to just so you know that when you come to Pacific, the faculty will be teaching you and they will know your name and you will know theirs. But I also think it's really important for a student to ask if they want to talk to another student who's studying there from their home country, from their major. They absolutely can do that. And they should do that, because I think during this time period where you have students who have a lot more access to information and there's so much of it, sometimes the best resource is really just talking to a peer student, someone who may be from your home country or maybe from your major or has had an experience. You should reach out and have the university connect you with them. We do that for many of our students here. And it's such a powerful tool to speak to someone who's your peer, who's going through an experience that you will have.
Absolutely. And Jenny, you bring up such a good point that, not being able to visit campus certainly is not a new challenge for international students, but hopefully what maybe has happened as a result of all of this is that universities have realized that they need to offer sort of virtual campus tours and online visit options and access to students and faculty members, because they're also seeing that domestic students who want to apply to their institutions can't visit campus. And so they've been able to maybe put a little bit more behind those resources and make them available to students, which is great. And I think to echo both points, there's loads of stuff out there for students to look at, and you should not be afraid to get in touch with the university and ask if there's a piece of information you're missing, or if you want to speak to a student or faculty member. It is critically important that students feel as informed as possible before making this big decision. Steve, we've had a few questions about English language testing, and I think there's a lot of stress around that for international students right now because testing centers have been closed or operating on a limited basis. Can you talk to us about how you've handled that at University of Utah? Have you been able to be flexible with those requirements and work with students to make sure they're still able to submit some form of the requirements? But we've had a handful of questions come in about that from the audience and via email, so I want to make sure we touch on it.
Sure, yeah, that is certainly an ongoing concern. And the University of Utah, except the TOEFL and IELTS, those are our main sort of vehicles for testing at this moment. We're looking to expand that to include, some other avenues that we previously have not used. And it's in response to this very question, is that we know that in some places, access to those tests, the two we use anyway, is not as commonplace as it was previously. Unfortunately, because of the way this works, there are some federal requirements that we have to go through to expand our sort of range of examinations that we can accept. So if you see an institution that has sort of limited options, there may be a reason for that that's sort of beyond the institution's control. We are in the process of hopefully adding some other options like Duolingo and some other things like that. but that review process takes a while, and it's out of the university's hands. It actually goes through an adjudication process that can be a little bit of a lengthy time. But we're trying to be as flexible as we possibly can in terms of how we handle students applying and at the point of admission and a point of arrival around the examinations. But in some cases, there are limited opportunities for universities to adapt quickly on this front. My advice would just be, we're trying to be as understanding and as flexible as we can, but for applicants to remember that sometimes there's things going on behind the scenes that kind of freeze us in place on the testing front, because it's not entirely in our hands.
Great, and I would say that for students who are really finding it a challenge because testing centers aren't open, or because they're open on a limited basis, or open and then closed. I mean, I think we're all experiencing this sort of day-to-day change in what is available and in the circumstances due to COVID. I would encourage students to contact the universities and explain their circumstances, and perhaps they're willing to work with them to figure out some sort of solution, because it is, I mean, as you mentioned, Steve, it's requiring universities to think on their feet and to be as adaptable as possible, but it's a bit like trying to turn a cruise ship sometimes. I mean, you just can't make those changes overnight, but I think by and large, they are really trying to be as accommodating as possible to students who are facing these types of difficulties. Great. We have 10 minutes left, and what I'd really like to do is just run through each of you and ask you to just give sort of your last bit of advice to students who are considering studying in the US. I mean, we started this session by saying circumstances are challenging and students are feeling a bit daunted or nervous about the prospect of studying in America, and COVID and politics and all of these things that are making that decision even more difficult. But it seems to me that the overriding themes of this discussion have actually been, it's a great time to go to the United States. University doors are open. They're excited to welcome international students. And so I hope that students will leave this session with that feeling, but I'd love it if each of you could just give sort of one last bit of advice to international students who are considering studying in the United States and possibly feeling nervous or uncertain about that choice. What would you tell them? And Jamie, we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think I can definitely say that my experience as an international student going from New Zealand to the States, to Harvard, Stanford, and then also Oxford in the UK was fundamentally transformative to my world. I didn't know what Wall Street was when I left New Zealand. I'd never thought about creating a company. And it was only because I was able to tap into the kind of network and resources that were available at these top US institutions that it really enabled me to build, a great organization and go through all of these experiences. So I would say for those in the call, this is categorically a life transformative path if you get it right to these top schools. You've got to be choosing the right institution, but it is well worth the hustle. And I've seen many students around the world actually during COVID, pushing hard, getting their applications to business school over the line, getting into the Whartons, Harvard, the MITs of the world, and actually really thriving in this kind of adversity. It's a great time to be applying when there are less applicants than normal to a lot of these programs. And so I'd really encourage you to, go full steam ahead, take advantage of this, and we're more than happy to help in any way we can at Crimson for sure.
Thank you. Sita, any last words of advice?
Yeah, sure. I would say that it seems that there are so many opportunities open to students when they do go to study in the US, and that while that there are lots of challenges right now, it definitely seems that universities are adapting and growing and learning and opening their doors to international students and trying to find different ways to make sure that they feel safe and cared for, and just ensure that you kind of read up as much as you can before you make the decision.
Great, thanks. Jenny?
I was just reflecting on some of the comments we addressed today, and I think for students who are concerned, around financing, for students who are concerned about travel, about finding the right quality program, about the return on their investment and employability, actually, there really isn't a better time to apply than now. And of course, for students who are also concerned about, flexible English policies and test optional changes that will be coming from many institutions that include mine and those in the Shorelight partnerships, I think students should seriously consider looking at all of the changes that are probably currently in place at some institutions and coming as a result of previous administration and the change to the new one, and not delay in applying and moving forward in their plans for a higher education. Actually, it is a really tremendous time to apply and start your plans to come to the US now.
Great, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Steve.
You know, I mentioned earlier, approaching things with a sense of optimism. You know, the value and the power of a degree from a United States college or university is still unblemished, in my opinion, and it's still worth it. You know, you've heard a lot about the outcomes, about the value of the experience, and that's all still true. There are lots of distractions out there right now, you know, from the election and sort of some of the civil things that have happened in the United States, and those are real, but they represent extreme sort of pieces of what our culture is like. There's lots of positives and lots of good that still also go on that don't get as reported as often. And they're still found, I think, in great and abundant variety on college campuses. Why wouldn't you want to be part of that? Because that is, you know, the virtue of coming to a college wherever you're going. But I think that this is a great time to study in the US for that reason alone.
Absolutely. Great. Well, I think it's really great to end the session on those positive notes and those reassuring notes for students. I know there were lots of questions that we didn't get to from the audience, but I want to say thank you so much to the audience for your thoughtful and relevant questions. Please don't forget that we have a wealth of tools and resources available to you through Times Higher Education and our partners, Crimson and Shorelight. And also stay tuned to THE in 2021 because we're going to have lots of events throughout the year that are going to dive even deeper into some of these topics. So we will talk more specifically and in more detail about funding and about writing personal statements and things like that in ways that we couldn't get into during this session. I also want to say a final word of thanks to our panelists for your time today. I mentioned when we started that it was an incredibly unpleasant hour for all of you, very early in the morning or very late at night. So your willingness to join us today and to share your expertise with us is really just further proof of how strongly you believe in the experience for international students in the US and how firmly you support that. So we know that there's a lot of tough questions and a lot of uncertainty right now, but your insight has been incredibly helpful and reassuring to students. So many thanks to all of you for your time and your expertise today. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next THE student event. Thank you.